Hi, everybody. I'm Ryan Arvay. I am the Director of Preservation and Historic Properties with Historic Savannah Foundation. And I wear a couple different hats at the foundation, but one of my main roles is that of manager of the Revolving Fund. And that's going to be the subject of our discussion tonight. The Revolving Fund is the primary tool we use to save endangered, vacant, blighted properties in Savannah, and has pretty much been since the very beginning of the foundation. If you can't already tell from the title of tonight's presentation, I am giving HSF more than a fair share of credit for why Savannah looks the way she does today, why she's so well preserved. Um, I think it's justified. I hope by the end of tonight's presentation you will too. But I would be remiss if I didn't pause and mention many of the efforts and people that came before the HSF era. And what I mean by that is anything after 1955. Um, and that includes starting in the very beginning with Mary Telfair and her decision in the 19th century to donate her house to be preserved as a museum. Or maybe it was the concerted effort and fight in the 1930s to prevent roads and traffic being run right through the middle of our squares. As you know, that happened to three of the squares on Montgomery Street, and you can see that here on Elbert Square. And of course, there was a group of individuals who contributed to Savannah's preservation early on. In the 1940s, Mary and Hansel Hillier restored the area known today as Trustee's Garden, including the Pirate's House. You have Walter Hartridge, who many have said knew every building, every street, every square, every cobblestone in Savannah. And in the early days, before HSF, constituted a one-man movement. You have individuals like Millsby Lane Jr., a prominent banker and philanthropist and preservationist at heart. Jim Williams, and people like Beth Ryder. Beth actually started with HSF in the 60s and went on to have a long and productive career with the city, instituting many programs and ordinances that still protect Savannah today. And then a little bit more contemporary, we have the Savannah College of Art and Design, kind of a bookend to the HSF era. SCAD came into being. The university was founded in 1978. So almost 3 decades after HSF was saving buildings and stabilizing neighborhoods. And SCAD is important because they bought up a lot of the big buildings, what we call white elephants, that our foundation really didn't have the capacity to take on. And so saving those large institutional buildings filled a void. And we are very grateful for that. But I want to start off by kind of going back to the beginning of the foundation and go back to 1955 and discuss not only how the organization was created, but specifically the revolving fund. And you see here a newspaper article featuring Reed Williamson, our first executive director, standing on Bay Street in front of a building that we saved in 1968. Now, if there are any long-term Savannah residents listening, you may know some of this history, but it bears repeating. In 1955, this is pretty much how Savannah looked, even downtown, even in the Landmark District. Vacant properties, broken out windows, overgrown tree lawns, high vacancy. Lots of people had fled to new suburbs, leaving whole blocks empty. Lots of neighborhoods became low rent districts, and there was very little to no tourism. And this was the Savannah in which HSF was founded. And it really culminated in 1954 with the demolition of this building, the City Market on Ellis Square. This is the 1890s version of that market that replaced even earlier versions. And by 1954, with new air conditioned grocery stores opening up all over the downtown, this large open air market was seen as obsolete, and it was demolished for, of all things, a parking lot, right? That's what everything seems to be demolished for. And Savannah residents really mourned the loss of this building, and it was just the following year, in 1955, that the Isaiah Davenport House, circa 1820, Davenport House, was threatened with demolition again for what else? A parking lot. The Davenport House is adjacent to the beautiful Kehoe House, a large 3-story imposing brick Victorian mansion, which at that time was being utilized for as a funeral home, and the funeral home wanted to use this land as a parking lot. Fortunately, Anna Colquitt Hunter, a local journalist and artist and activist, stepped forward and gathered together 6 of her good friends, all of whom were influential within their own right and within their own circles. And they made it their mission to save the Davenport House from demolition. This was the beginnings of Historic Savannah Foundation. And from these humble beginnings, they created a movement that really went on to save an entire city. And this is how they did it. I'm going to go over a brief timeline now to give you a little bit more context. So the organization is officially, formally founded in 1955, and by 1959, we were purchasing our second property. This is Marshall Row. It's on Oglethorpe Avenue, and it is a multi-unit, traditional mid-19th century townhomes, connected townhomes. This property was slated for demolition. In fact, it had a series of carriage houses behind it on the lane that in 1959 had already been demolished. Back in the mid 20th century, demolition in Savannah was actually incentivized. The materials that were in these buildings were actually seen as more valuable than the buildings themselves. And particularly the Savannah gray brick that made up these properties were much coveted for new modern construction. South of town in the suburbs, all these new suburbs were going up with these ranch style homes, and developers wanted the brick. SCAD professor Robin Williams actually says that back in the 50s, downtown was something of a rock quarry for new construction. And the Marshall Row was one of those properties that had been purchased by a developer and was slated for demolition. And HSF was able to intercede, purchase this property. At the time, there were individual members who were purchasing properties. The organization had very little money. And even though their name was on the deed, it was actually individual members, such as Lee Adler, who were signing their names to the deeds. They were putting their own neck on the line. If this venture was unsuccessful, it would be them who were financially responsible. And they were the ones that were assuming all of the risk for the fledgling organization. And they said at the time, profit is not the aim of the investment. But they were successful. They were able to find tenants for the building, and thereby proving that real estate was a valid way, valid means of preservation. It wasn't until 1964, after a couple other similar acquisitions, it wasn't until 1964 that HSF formally raised money for the revolving fund. They said, look, let's alleviate the burden on some of our members, and let's do some formal fundraising. They raised $200,000 uh, which they used to then buy 54 properties in 18 months. That should give you some indication just as to how depressed the market was in Savannah at the time, how low property values were. $200,000 in 1964 is close to a little over $2 million today, adjusting for inflation. You couldn't buy 54 properties today with $2 million. That's how depressed the values were at the time. In 1966, the National Historic Landmark District was formed in Savannah. That is essentially the downtown district with all of the squares. That coincided with the passing of the Federal National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. The following year, HSF saved nearly all of the properties around Monterey Square. At the time, Armstrong College was located in the Armstrong Mansion at the north end of Forsyth Park. And the college was expanding and they needed more room. They owned most of the properties surrounding the square, including the Noble Hardy House, where Alec Raskin's Antiques are located today. They also owned the famous Mercer House on Monterey Square. All of these buildings were in danger as Armstrong laid out their plans to demolish them and build a new campus. Fortunately, Mills B. Lane Jr., who I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, he stepped forward and said, I have about 300 acres south of downtown that I am willing to donate to the college so that they can build a formal campus if you will agree not to tear the buildings down and instead sell them to HSF, which the college did. And we were able to sell them to preservation-minded buyers, put easements and covenants on them. One of the individuals that we sold to was Jim Williams, and most of you will recognize that name. He made this property his house for a time, which was the location for many of the events in Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. In 1968, we conducted our first formal survey of historic buildings, which we compiled and published in the kind of landmark book Historic Savannah, which is now in its third edition. Not a complete survey of every single building, but a valuable resource nonetheless. With all of our early successes, we did still witness a few monumental losses. And that includes the loss of the Beaux Arts train station, Union Station, located on Martin Luther King Boulevard, then West Broad Street. And in the 1960s, a lot of railroad companies were seeing declining usage and were frankly failing. The Department of Transportation came along and purchased the railroad right-of-way and demolished the station. You see here in this old newspaper article from the time, signified by the red star, that is where the train station stood. Today there is a freeway overpass where the station once was. We call it the flyover, and it crosses MLK and drops down onto Montgomery Street. Maybe even more tragic than the loss of the train station was the loss of the neighborhood immediately adjacent to it. Seen here in outlined in red, this was a dense, historic, traditionally African-American neighborhood, sometimes called Frogtown. A lot of the workers at the Georgia Central Complex lived in this area, and it was wiped clean in the name of urban renewal, and housing projects were built in its place. Those same projects survive to this day. And this, of course, was the result of racial inequality, short-sighted politicians, our car culture. But I think it was also something of a blind spot for preservationists as well. I think at the time they were so focused on saving the historic core, the downtown and the squares and the large homes on the squares. They just didn't pay enough attention to this area, and a lot was lost. The culture, the stories, the history and the buildings in these neighborhoods. This is a general overview of historic districts in the downtown. There are more historic districts than are reflected in this map, but these are the primary districts that we focus in, namely the Landmark District at the top, Victorian District below that, Thomas Square, Kyler Brownville, and East Side. We tend to focus more in areas that will benefit from the additional investment. Um, for instance, we've never done a lot of work in Ardsley Park or Chatham Crescent because those neighborhoods have always remained rather stable over time. They did not suffer from the same disinvestment and high vacancy that some of the adjacent neighborhoods have. And of course, when you have vacancy, the buildings tend to deteriorate and have condition issues and are generally more endangered. So that is where we try to focus. The criteria for selecting a property to purchase is pretty simple. Number one, is the building vacant? We never want to displace anybody ever, so the buildings must be unoccupied. Number two, they must be endangered, which means they either suffer from long term neglect or there's an imminent threat of demolition. And number three, as I was mentioning, the buildings must be in our target area, meaning that the area, the neighborhood, would benefit the most from the additional investment. We only have limited funds, and so we have to prioritize where those funds are spent. The revolving fund gets its name from its cyclical nature. The process is pretty simple. Starting at the top in the 12 o'clock position, we purchase a vacant, endangered historic building. We always do so with funds that have been privately raised. All capital comes either from private donors or grants. We don't receive any kind of public assistance or public funding of any kind. We then immediately clean up the property, usually with a volunteer cleanup. We stabilize it, we make minor repairs, and then we immediately begin to market it to preservation minded buyers. HSF rarely carries out the restoration or rehab of the building ourselves. We look to a buyer to do that. And the reason is that it takes several $100,000 to restore these types of properties. And that money would be tied up for at least a year. Our intent is always to keep as much of that money out on the street, hard at work, protecting and acquiring buildings to protect them. And so we sell them to preservation minded buyers, but we do so with easements on the property. And an easement is essentially, it grants the organization the legal oversight of design on the property in perpetuity. It runs with the land, and even if a current owner was to sell it, all subsequent owners are still subject to that easement. It's just an extra layer of protection. And then continuing on, the money from the sale goes right back into saving another property. And of course, the revolving fund can't possibly save and acquire all endangered properties in Savannah. We just have too much housing stock. But we will often provide other types of assistance to property owners, including technical assistance. We will often come out and make site visits and advise property owners on the best way to maintain their property. Or we might make referrals and recommendations of trusted service professionals, architects and engineers and contractors. We will also provide advocacy on behalf of property owners. If a property is, say, cited by code compliance, or an owner is called to appear before recorder's court, we will often appear on their behalf or with them to advocate for protecting the property, maybe a little bit extra time to make those repairs. Sometimes we might even intercede and help make some of those repairs, as I will illustrate later on in another example. We also provide research and design assistance. A lot of times property owners aren't really sure what aspects of their house are historic and which aren't, which ones should be protected and which ones are maybe later replacements or additions. And we also have our plaque program. Our handsome bronze plaques are on many historic buildings across Savannah. Part of the services we provide is not just the physical plaque itself, but we also do research on the house. What year was it built? Who was it built for? Who were some of the earliest residents? Did it have a prominent architect, and so forth? So I'd like to go through some of the process in a little bit more detail, kind of illustrating some of the things that I just mentioned. And I promise that if you stick with me through some of this more technical aspects of the presentation, I will reward you with some really pretty before and after photos at the end. Everyone loves before and after photos. Uh, this property is 1316 1318 Price Street. It was built in 1913 as a duplex. And I kind of want to show you, using this property, the condition of most properties when we purchase them, and kind of walk you through the process. So this particular property came to our attention because the lady who lived here had passed away, and her niece was the administrator for her estate. And she called us. I wish that happened more often. It doesn't happen nearly enough, but she reached out to HSF and said, "Are you interested in purchasing the property?" I said, "Certainly." I went by the house to take a look at it, and this is how I found it. The front door was damaged and wide open, so the building was unsecured. Got her permission to go in. I said, "No need to come out and meet me. The house is already opened if you don't object." And so walked into the house, and it appeared as if Archie Bunker had just stepped out to get a beer. 1970s time capsule. And this is generally how we find most of our properties. The former occupants' furnishings and possessions are still in them. We always reach out to the family and give them ample opportunity to collect any of the belongings that they are interested in. In this particular case, the niece didn't want any of this, and we were able to put most of it out on the sidewalk and offer it to the neighborhood. Those items not claimed are always donated to Habitat for Humanity or Salvation Army. And of course, there are always some items that have to end up in the dumpster. But this is generally the condition that we found the property in, and lots of stuff in disarray. Also, some noticeable damage there in the ceiling where the flashing around the chimney had failed, and a lot of the water had been infiltrating the interiors kind of unabated for a couple years. And you can see why there is the need to clean these properties up before we can even begin to think of marketing them. Fortunately, HSF has an army of volunteers that regularly come out and support us. Many of them regularly sign up for these early morning cleanups, in which we do everything from removing old carpeting to reveal the hardwood floors. We get the entire property in broom clean condition. In this particular case, we pulled up a few layers of old linoleum to reveal an old 1920s newspaper, the ink from which had kind of fused to the floorboards and became a permanent part of the house. Another property that we worked on recently, 625 East Broad, was in similar condition, maybe a little bit worse, but the ownership of the house is worth noting. Whereas the Price Street property was owned by the estate of the late owner, and they came to us, offering the house to us. Broad Street was a situation in which we had to go seek out the owner. And the ownership turned out to be a little bit more complicated than we anticipated. This was a property that had been on my radar screen for a couple years. It's a small Victorian duplex. There's actually 2 units as part of this house. And when I finally went by the house to check on it, I went up onto the front porch, knocked on the door, thinking that maybe someone would come to the door. There was mail spilling out of the mailbox, and so I was pretty sure it was vacant. The door opened up by itself, so the house was unsecured. I did not enter because even though it was officially vacant, it was obvious that someone was living in the property, though unofficially. And there was evidence of that on the floor right inside the front room. I'll leave that to your imagination what that was. Um, but both units were in this same condition. And if you look through the front room to the rear of the property there, you can see light coming into the kitchen. That's because there was a huge hole in the ceiling. And this was a situation where we had to try and find the owner. Now, we start by looking at the property card on the tax assessor's website. And just after a quick Google of that individual's name, we found out that she was, in fact, deceased and had been deceased for a couple of years. But the obituary listed the name of her daughter. And so we were able to reach out to her and find her, and she granted us an opportunity to look through the house. And it's important to remember that Historic Savannah Foundation does not buy properties that are on the market. If a building is officially listed and represented by a realtor, there are good chances that the building is going to be saved. Buildings that are on the market are low-hanging fruit. What HSF does is we climb up to the top of the tree and we shake loose the fruit at the top that no one can reach. These are properties that have been vacant for several years, and there's generally reasons why. And this particular case exemplifies that. You have a family member whose parent passed away, and they didn't have the resources to maintain the house. Perhaps there weren't resources available to them to even probate the property so that they could even take ownership of it. A lot of the times you can't get a loan for a property that you don't officially own. And in this particular case, taking ownership of the property was something that the daughter had trouble with. Now, we only learned this after we agreed to purchase the property from her, but she was not the biological daughter of the late owner. Unfortunately, that formal process had never taken place, even though the previous owner had raised her from the age of 6. And probate law, you might know, has a very particular hierarchy. So if someone passes away, usually the property or a portion of the proceeds will go to a late spouse or parents or children. And if that individual had no children, then to siblings or their children. And that was the case here. Because Miss Hall here had never been formally adopted, probate law would dictate that the proceeds would go to her cousins. And that seemed unfair because Miss Hall had taken care of her mother in her old age in this house and had done the very best she could to maintain it and keep the taxes paid. So we talked to our attorney, and our attorney was actually able to utilize a law called virtual adoption. And through a series of affidavits, we were able to establish within reason that Miss Hall had in fact been raised by the late Miss Jackson. And therefore, the probate judge recognized her as the rightful and legal heir to Miss Jackson's estate. And so Miss Hall was able to enter into a contract with us to sell the property to us. And though it took a lot of extra time, we were able to save this property. And shortly after we closed, Miss Hall said to me, Ryan, I feel so much better. Now I can drive by the house and I don't have to feel sad about it anymore. And that's really as much as we could hope for. There was a lot of pressure on her. Code compliance had condemned the property, and the adjacent property owner to the south had actually offered her $10,000 more than anyone else was willing to pay if she would agree to sell to him, because he wanted to tear the building down and put a driveway between these two properties to a parking lot in the rear. So this house was genuinely endangered, and I really believe had HSF not come along when we did, the house would not be standing still. As far as the cleanup is concerned, it was not a safe situation to put volunteers in. So we did contract with Surf Pro of Savannah to clean the house out. They had to don hazmat suits to do so. The interior was very soggy. There was some drug paraphernalia. There was dangerous conditions in terms of mold and moisture in the house. But once they were able to go through the property, it went from looking like this to this. And though still rough around the edges, now it's cleaned out. Now we can safely bring the public through and hold an open house. The next door unit appeared like this. After Surf Pro cleaned it out, it looked like this. That slant that you see in the floor is not a camera trick or a trick of the eye. That is indicative of the foundation problems in the house in that particular area. And we found this old photo from the 1970s of the house in our files. And you see there's a little girl sitting on the porch. I had so hoped that that was Mrs. Hall. It turned out it's not. It's likely one of her relatives. But I thought, how great would that have been to have been able to present this picture of the house to her with her sitting on the porch. Originally, when this house was built in the late 1890s, the original owner had 3 identical houses built at the corner of Nichols and East Broad. So fortunately, we had an identical house next door for reference. And that was important because HSF always develops a design for each property that we buy and sell. And the reason we do that is because we sell the properties with an easement on it. And because we have oversight over the rehab, we want to clearly communicate our expectations. We want it very clear to the new buyer what the house should look like when they are finished. I do the research and essentially develop the design, and then I partner with a draftsperson that we hire or contract with. And in this particular case, this was the overall design for 625 East Broad. The showstopper is the beautiful Victorian porch with all its articulated detail, the spindles and the corbels. Our design called for the entire balustrade to be reconstructed and identical historic doors. Those were long lost, and we were recommending period-appropriate doors. The new owner who purchased this property is actually living in the entire building. So we allowed him to cut a hole in the adjoining wall so that he could pass from one unit into the other. But the exterior appearance maintains its historic character. And he put a brand new standing seam roof on it, rebuilt the chimney stack, and is nearly completed with the porch. I'm not going to show you an after photo of this property because it really would be inappropriate without the porch being finished. But if you contact me in another 3-4 months, I promise I will send you a photo of the completed project. And one more property, talking about design. 521 East Bolton is a property that we first saw in late 2015. And at the time, the front porch was braced up because it was literally falling off of the house. And it was very clear, just looking at it, that it was not original. It was mostly dimensional lumber and plywood. It was Home Depot porch posts. And before we were actually able to acquire the property, code compliance cited the previous owner and mandated that they remove the porch, which again, we were fine with. So by 2016, when we purchased it, the house looked like it does here on the right. No porch. And we had no photographs of how the building originally appeared when we didn't know how it should look. Now, fortunately, we have a few resources, such as the Sanborn maps. Now, the Sanborn Fire Insurance Company used to create detailed maps of major U.S. cities. And each property was reflected. The original footprint was reflected in each map. Yellow is wood frame house. Pink houses were masonry. And there at the very bottom, you see 521 East Bolton. And you can see the little dashed line is the porch, and it has a number 1 on it, which means that it was a single story. And the little circle there in the corner means that it had a metal roof on it. So we had more information than we did before. We knew it was going to be a single story, full width front porch. And so we looked around at some other nearly identical buildings in the area, and this is the design that we came up with. These drawings were done by Josh Ward of Ward Architecture. And so we go from this to the finished product. Pretty darn successful. The porch posts that you see on there, 2 of those 3 porch posts were actually rescued from the rear of the property. We believe that they were actually the original front porch posts that were moved when the porch was reconfigured at some point. But the positive impacts that we had on this particular property didn't stop at the exterior facade. Our conservation easement on the property also extended to certain interior spaces as well. Originally, this house was built as a single-family home with a traditional side hall plan with an open staircase. Sometime early on in the house's history, the house was converted to a duplex, and the hallway and the staircase were enclosed, creating 2 separate units, one upstairs and one downstairs. So when we first purchased the property, if you were to enter in through the front door, you would have immediately been met by another door, which itself opened up into a dark, cramped staircase leading to the apartment upstairs. And you can see on the left some of those original elements, the stairs, the newel post there. On the right, at the top of the landing, you'll see the original balustrade. And we used this information to design the restoration of the stairs. And one of our terms of sale was that the new owner had to restore the original single-family floor plan, which they did. They reopened the stairs, recreated missing portions of it, and now the staircase is full of natural light and much more open. The revolving fund doesn't always purchase properties outright. Sometimes we will partner with other organizations or entities. Just recently, in 2019, we partnered with the city to rehab the Caretaker's Cottage on Meldrum Row. Meldrum Row is a historic series of workers' cottages that are located on both sides of MLK Boulevard at about West 33rd and West 34th Streets. You may remember, probably in 2014, the city chose this location as the site of the future Mid-City Police Precinct. There was for a long time a narrow stretch, about a block wide, the full length of the Thomas Square district that was unprotected. It was just this kind of no man's land in between 2 historic districts. And because it didn't have any protection, it made it ideal for development. HSF strenuously objected, not just because of the loss of historic buildings, but this row of housing was particularly important because it represented some of the very first affordable housing in the South. Built and developed by Judge and then Mayor of Savannah, Peter Meldrum, for the African American community. After the Civil War and into the late 19th century, African Americans moved in large numbers into the South's larger cities from the countryside, seeking opportunity. And Peter Meldrum, who was, for the time, a little bit more progressive, thought that this community needed decent, affordable housing. And so he built all of this probably in the 1890s. So we thought it was especially regrettable that in the 21st century, right off of Martin Luther King Boulevard, that this historic African-American housing would be demolished for the new precinct. The demolition did proceed, but HSF was successful in brokering a deal with the city. We pledged $50,000 towards the restoration of this key anchor corner building, which the city agreed to. And in 2019, they commenced the rehabilitation, and the building went looking like this to this. And it is currently 2 units of affordable housing for police officers working at the precinct building. In fact, one of the current tenants was, prior to moving in, commuting a 3-hour round trip to Savannah every day for work, and now conveniently lives right across from the precinct. It is a subsidized rent in return for certain duties at the precinct, and was all around a very successful project. HSF used their dedicated funds to help develop the plans and drawings, also help pay for the windows, shutters, and just generally making sure that the project was done historically accurate. And now, as I promised, for sticking with me during some of the technical aspects of the presentation, I have for you a series of before and after photos. These are all projects that have been done within the last 10, 20 years, starting here on the 500 block of East Jones Street in the 1990s. The city had slated 9 properties for demolition on this block alone. And so HSF stepped in. We purchased all 9 properties, which we then helped to rehab and find new buyers for. And so this particular section of the block went looking like this to this. And this is part of the Beach Institute neighborhood, which is which is the easternmost boundary of the Landmark District. And this property on Habersham was already vacant when a car ran into the front of it on the left there, taking out the left-hand stoop. The city wanted to demolish it, and HSF was able to step in, find a preservation-minded buyer, and today it looks like this. This is the P.J. O'Connor house at the corner of 32nd and Lincoln. This substantial Italianate house was actually owned by P.J. O'Connor, the relative of legendary Savannah author Flannery O'Connor. And this is a case where HSF put the house's salvation and preservation above our bottom line. We put the mission first. When we sell a property, we do it through an RFP process. That's request for proposals. We solicit different proposals from anyone interested in purchasing the property, but we do not put the emphasis on the bid, on the highest bidder. We are looking for various things that will help us decide who is going to be the best steward for the property. So we are looking at things like past experience rehabbing historic homes, intended end use, and things such as that. So we have the ability to look at multiple bids and choose the one that's best for the house. And in this particular case, we had 3 bids, and we went with the middle bidder. The highest bid wanted to turn the house into apartments, and the middle bidder wanted to live in the house. It would be owner occupied. And even though we would lose out on potential profit, we decided to do what was best for the house. And we always put the property first. And I think we made the right decision. This particular house was sold to a SCAD preservation professor, Jim Abraham, who undertook a thorough and loving rehab, including a full restoration of the front porch. HSF was gifted a small 2-inch by 2-inch photograph of this house, which included a view of the original front porch, which had been altered many, many years ago. And so Jim was able to faithfully recreate that. This house was actually a part of our bigger Lincoln Street initiative, which included this property at 1704 Lincoln, a multi-unit building. This was actually one of the instances where HSF did the entire rehab from start to finish. We got some money from HGTV, some money from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and carried out the full rehab, uh, taking the building from this to this. This is the Berrien House. This in 2014 was one of the last unrestored 18th century houses on Broughton Street. Um, it was originally built as a single family home and over the years underwent really dramatic changes. They removed the front stoop and the front stairs. They raised the building so they could have a proper storefront on Broughton. The original wood siding was covered up with stucco. Um, and after many years, the building just fell into, disuse and disrepair. HSF never actually purchased this building, but we did have an easement on the property. Um, this illustrates one of the um, key benefits of having protective easements on a property. The western wall of this property was near collapse, and the city was putting pressure on the owner to demolish it. But because we had an easement, that easement actually granted us certain legal rights to make repairs ourselves, even though we didn't own the building. And we did spend about $50,000 reinforcing that wall, thereby, at least giving the building a stay of execution, as it were. Now, the money that we spent on the property did not come back to us. The owner at the time didn't want to pay for those repairs, and so we did have to put a lien on the property. Eventually, a proper savior did come forward interested in buying the house. As it turns out, it was actually a descendant of James Berrien who purchased the house in order to restore it, James Berrien being the original builder and owner of the property. Of course, that individual did not want to have to satisfy our lien or pay any extra for the property, so we just flat out forgave it. We just wiped the lien out. That way, the rehab was able to proceed unhindered. And I think you will agree that the outcome speaks for itself. Not only did they rebuild the front stoop, but they actually lowered the first floor back to its original height. So this house has that kind of raised basement, which was enlarged in the 19th century for that storefront. As part of the rehab, the new owner actually lowered the house back down to its original height. Um, the building inside had been cut up into apartments, and he restored it to its original floor plan, including full restoration of the upstairs ballroom. This is the Snedeker House over in the East Side neighborhood. This was another property that was in very sorry condition. When it rained outside, it rained inside. And it was facing a lot of demolition pressure as well from the city. So HSF bought it. And we bought it at the height of the market in 2008. So this is a cautionary tale. As you all know, the bottom fell out of the barrel and the housing market collapsed. No one was really buying homes for several years after that. There was a surplus of housing on the market, and people weren't buying, especially large distressed properties such as this one. So we had to sit on it for several years. And eventually, I think in about 2013, a young couple came forward and said they wanted to buy it and make it their home. And we did sell it at a considerable loss, but it was really the right thing to do because, once again, the house couldn't sit in its present condition much longer. It really was a matter of acting quickly and saving the home or potentially losing it along with our investment. And even though we didn't come close to recouping the acquisition price, I think you'll agree it was the right thing to do. The house continues to stand proudly today. It made a lovely home, and it's just a really unique property in that East Side neighborhood. And finally, this property on West 41st Street, HSF's revolving fund actually saved this property twice. We never owned it, but the first time we got involved was to alleviate, once again, some demolition pressure from the city. You can see there's a porch column missing there, and the porch roof was weak. The city was worried about it collapsing, but the structure itself was relatively sound. So we put a little bit of money into shoring up the porch, making sure it was properly supported, and alleviating some of the demolition pressure. And that really bought the house a little bit more time until eventually a young couple came along and wanted to fix it up. When that young couple went to the bank to secure funding for this project, that is once again where HSF entered the scene. A lot of the times, banks are a little bit apprehensive about these old projects. Old homes carry with them certain risks, there are certain unknown variables, and oftentimes, if this is a property owner's first project of this type, they require an extra loan guarantee. That's an extra amount of money down on the property to secure the loan. But most people don't have extra cash on hand. So HSF implemented a $50,000 loan guarantee on deposit at Queensboro National Bank, and property owners can utilize this money to secure funding. The young couple was able to get their loan, carry out the rehab, mow the roof of this building, make all the necessary repairs. And eventually, when the project was completed, the bank inspected the home, converted the construction loan into a traditional mortgage, and HSF got its $50,000 back. And we continue to have that available at Queensboro to this day. It is used on a project by project basis. So if it's currently being used, it's tied up for a little bit. But it's just another illustration of how HSF can help save properties. Sometimes it might be through direct acquisition. Sometimes it might be through a partnership. Sometimes it might be through making minor repairs, or it might be through a loan guarantee. But HSF is always out there working on behalf of Savannah and her historic structures. A few years ago, I was in Providence, Rhode Island for an NDC training. That's National Development Council. It was a week-long training, and I had the opportunity while there to meet Clark Shuttle. At the time, he was the executive director of the Providence Revolving Fund, which is a very influential and productive and robust revolving fund. And I was talking to Clark about Savannah, and he said that in the early days, it was Historic Savannah Foundation and our revolving fund that served as the model for the Providence Revolving Fund. In fact, he said it was Lee Adler, early HSF member and president, who would travel the country spreading the gospel of revolving funds, as it were, and teaching different cities how to do what we were doing in Savannah. And he said, quote, when Lee Adler spoke at Providence Preservation Society's annual meeting in the late 1970s, he used his unique style and stature to convey the Savannah story to an audience that wasn't sure it was ready to take the same step. By the time he was finished, he had convinced everyone that this was the only way to go, and that Providence needed a revolving fund if it was to be relevant. To be effective, we needed to be able to intervene in the real estate market and have control over the outcome. Real estate was the name of the game. His confidence was contagious. And I think this quote from Clark illustrates not just how influential our revolving fund has been within the city limits of Savannah, but all over the country, there are revolving funds that exist today because of that early influence. Cities that have been protected and preserved because HSF helped show them the way. At the outset of this presentation, I shared this old newspaper clipping with you featuring a photo of Reed Williamson And underneath his arm is an old fashioned kind of hand painted for sale sign that we used to use on our properties throughout Savannah. Just a few years ago, I was in a property that we had purchased on East 39th Street. And like so many of the properties that we have shared with you tonight, the house was full of the previous owner's possessions. And after we had arranged for a family member to take what they wanted, one of the items left behind was this old for sale sign. I don't know if it's the exact same sign that Reed is holding under his arm in that old 1968 photo, but it is definitely an identical sign. And we don't know actually why it was in the house, but as I stood there holding it, I took it as a literal and figurative sign that we were doing the right thing, that we were on the right track, that our predecessors, people like Reed Williamson or Lee Adler or Walter Hartridge or Beth Ryder or Mills B. Lane, were proud of us, that they were pleased with our efforts to preserve Savannah's historic buildings, and that they were smiling on us. I thank you for your attention this evening, for your interest, and now would be pleased to open it up to any questions. Thank you very much.